Well, I'd like to start by welcoming everybody and thank you for being with us tonight. My name is King Harris, and I am a trustee of the university, as well as chair of the Visiting Committee on Public Policy. We are actually thrilled as a visiting committee to be here in Washington for the first time. We're kind of proud because one of our ex-members is currently the President of the United States. We also would like to acknowledge the fact that we are joined tonight by not only members of our visiting committee and members of our Dean's International Council, but looking around the room, well over 100 graduates of both the university and especially the School for Public Policy Studies. I see that some of you during cocktails had little ribbons on your nameplates saying that you were one in 2019. And you may wonder, what is that all about? Well, it's about this. We have an exciting future ahead of us as a school, and one of the reasons we're going to have an exciting future is because we're going to have increased participation from all of our public policy graduates. And we hope whether they volunteer to help us on our various university programs, like tonight's event, whether they attend at least a few university events, or whether they contribute to the school, that by the year 2019, we would like 2019 of our grads to say they have helped the Harris School. We'd also like to thank Ambassador Faye Hartog-Levin, who serves on the Board of Trustees of the National Archives and made it possible for us to be here tonight. Thank you, Faye. And finally, I'm pleased to acknowledge the terrific partners we have at the Institute of Politics, who are presenting tonight's program. And the Institute's been a wonderful collaborator of our policy school since David Axelrod brought the program to the university. As a university, we've always prided ourselves in being a world-class research institution that's had a positive impact on society. And we believe that the Harris School can be a focal point of university efforts to better society. After all, we train women and men to go on to lead and shape policy in government, the not-for-profit world, and in private companies across the globe. This year happens to be our 25th anniversary as a graduate school, and it's also the year we are welcoming an exceptional new dean in Daniel Diermeyer, who will lead the school into its next chapter of excellence. As we look at the future of public policy, one thing from our point of view probably has the potential to have the greatest impact on our future, and that one thing is data. Governments, not-for-profit institutions, and businesses today, as all of you know, have tremendous access to data. And that access to data is leading to, hopefully, better policy decisions. For example, what is the most efficient way to route traffic through a city? When and where is violent crime going to take place? We heard at the university a couple months ago a really interesting speech by the new head of the Chicago Police Department talking about this very subject and how he was using data to make his department more effective. Which high school students are least likely to apply to college, even though they have the academic ability to succeed there? How do you lower maternal mortality rates in the developing world? Now, by the way, that was not an accident. All of these are important policy questions that can have a tremendous positive impact on society if answered correctly. And all of them can be better understood through data analysis. So, as you would expect, data science in public policy is a top focus of our school, our graduate school. And this fall, we are launching a new degree in data-driven policy making, which we call a Master's in Computational Analysis and Public Policy. It's going to be offered jointly by the Harris School and the University of Chicago's Computer Science Department. In addition, Chicago Harris has formed a new center on data science and public policy. Within the center, we are engaging leading practitioners like Rayid Gandhi, who was the chief scientist behind President Obama's 2012 campaign, and Brett Goldstein, who was formerly the chief information officer of the city of Chicago. Earlier this month, the center completed the second annual Eric and Wendy Schmidt Data Science for Social Good Fellowship Program, a program which brings computer science graduates from around the country to Chicago to apply their computational skills to problems with social impact. We think that we're at the forefront of what should be a very important intersection of computer science and public policy, helping to train men and women who will be policy leaders in the future. Tonight's panel will discuss the impact of data-driven journalism on public policy discourse. And we are honored to have such an esteemed panel of national journalists with us who will share their thoughts on how data has changed the dialogue about policy. Before we introduce our panel and hear from them, it is my pleasure to introduce Steve Edwards of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, our co-sponsor tonight. And so join me in welcoming Steve.
My thanks to King and to the entire visiting committee, the Dean's International Council, Dean Daniel Diermeyer, and the entire staff of Harris for partnering on this event and allowing us to participate. It's a great honor, and we benefit tremendously from everything that Harris brings to the university and to the world of politics and public policy more broadly. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Institute, we were founded 2 years ago by David Axelrod as a nonpartisan institute dedicated to strengthening the American political process through cultivating the next generation of leaders. And we do that through three principal means. One, we have programs focused on giving students hands-on opportunities in politics and public policy, principally through internships, but also civic engagement projects. Many of you in this room have been vital players in the effort to strengthen and establish our Summer in Washington program. We had more than 80 alums participate as mentors, as hosts, as site visit hosts and programmers all the way around for the students who were in Washington this past few months, and we greatly appreciate everything that you've done to reach out to our students. We also have a program that connects practitioners in public politics and public policy to the riches of the university, where we bring them to campus for fellowships for 10 weeks at a time in the fall and the spring. They have access to a wide array of university classes, faculty, research libraries, and the like. We don't require them to take the Common Core, however. We also don't require them to pass the swimming test, which, as you know, is no longer in existence anyway. We do require them to teach seminars, and they lead a weekly discussion seminar on the topic and area of their particular expertise. And finally, we do conversations just like the one you're about to hear tonight that help expand and elevate the public discourse. And we couldn't be more delighted or honored than to have this panel assembled for tonight's conversation. It's being led by Michael Shearer, who is the Washington bureau chief for Time magazine. Before assuming that role, he was the White House correspondent and a Washington correspondent for Time. He's also served as a Washington correspondent for Salon and for Mother Jones. He graduated from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Also with us tonight, next to him, E.J. Dionne, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, and a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown. You may know him, among other things, for his numerous media appearances and his best-selling books, including the 1991 classic Why Americans Hate Politics, and more recently, Our Divided Political Heart. He received a BA from Harvard and a doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Next to EJ is Ezra Klein, who is editor-in-chief of Vox.com, a general news website he founded, focusing on giving the public crucial contextual information to understand what is happening in the world today. He's a columnist for Bloomberg News, a regular contributor and policy analyst to MSNBC. Prior to that, he was a columnist for Newsweek and an associate editor at the American Prospect, and of course, oversaw the Washington Post's acclaimed Wonk blog, where among other acclaim, he was named Blogger of the Year by The Week magazine in 2001. Next to EJ, Megan McArdle, who, in addition to her perch at Bloomberg View, where she's a columnist, will be joining us on campus at the university this fall as an IOP Fall Fellow. Prior to joining Bloomberg View, she was a writer for the Newsweek, The Daily Beast, The Atlantic, and The Economist. She's known for her tremendous insights on economics, business, and public policy. She has a bachelor's degree from Penn and an MBA from U Chicago. And finally, to my far right is Simon Rogers, who is Twitter's data journalist. He launched and edited The Guardian's data blog and data store. He also served as news editor at The Guardian. In 2012, he received the Royal Statistical Society's Award for Statistical Excellence in Journalism. He's also the author of the book Facts Are Sacred. We're going to turn things over to them to get the conversation going. We'll take questions from all of you, but please join me in welcoming all of them here to the National Archives tonight.
The part that was left off my resume there is I started in journalism with the Daily Hampshire Gazette in 1998 when we didn't have access to the internet, we didn't have email, and where my editor, I remember, sent me as a cub reporter to a training, I think in Boston, on what was then called computer-assisted reporting, which basically meant using Excel, which was like a new thing we'd never done before. And as a result, I came back to the paper and like knew how to do percent change and things like that, and made them draw and produce a bar chart. And I think it was the first time, at least since I was there, that we actually ran a bar chart in the print paper of, I think it was school spending. Now we live in an age where just today, looking at Twitter, there were charts about Ebola rates, uninsured rates, income inequality. There were charts I saw today, polling on racial differences and views on corporal punishment. I mean, we live in an age now where so much of the media we consume is given to us as data, as visualized data, and that so many of the stories we live with on a day-to-day basis come from data. It's not to say that back then we weren't using data, we just weren't presenting it as data back in the 90s in the same way that we do today. So I want to start with Ezra, who runs Vox, which is, I would say, probably on the forefront of this effort to really tell stories through presenting data, through visualizing data, and just ask, is this, like, where do you place us now? Are we living in a renaissance of data journalism? And how is it different from how it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's a utopian paradise of data journalism, which you can tell because we fixed all of the problems. It's funny, I am somewhat of a skeptic on a lot of this sort of data journalism hype. And let me separate out a couple things. You do have a tremendous rise in the quantity and a lot of variance in the quality of data visualization, right? And I'll take some credit or blame for that. And part of the reason is that on social media, there is a tremendous reward to presenting things visually. There are study after this. It's also in my anecdotal experience, a piece of content that you put a graph in, the graph will get shared orders of magnitude more than text. And this is true almost across the board. So one thing that's happened, one of the reasons Mike talks about seeing on Twitter all these charts is that if you're consuming your news through social media, you're going to see many more of these because it just so happens that social media really likes data visualization. And because the media is now quite attentive to what social media does and does not like, we produce a lot more data visualization. There is also this other thing called data journalism. And here the terminology gets very loose and often conflated. I don't think, as much as I would like to think, that when I or one of my reporters or Mike in 1998 produce a bar chart, we have taken some great step for data journalism. The way I think about data journalism, at least when it's being done well, is that you have this thing called journalism, right? And journalism, the way has these different tools in the toolkit. And the one that people primarily think about is reporting. Journalists, the thing that make them a journalist is that they go and they talk to people, they call people, they go to things, they basically get information from other human beings. Then there's research, right, which is actually a bit of a different thing. If you just do research, you're not called a reporter, you're called something else. And that's always been around. It is not like someone that, my generation of folks were the first to realize you could read an academic paper. What was different around the time that I got into journalism is the ease with which you could access academic papers, think tank papers, the ability to just search on the Brookings website, say, and learn about whatever healthcare topic you happen to be confused on. Whereas, 10 years prior, it's a lot harder to go and find, say, an old Congressional Budget Office document telling you about, a Medicare change from 15 years ago. Sorry?
Siri talking.
Then, though, there is something that I think is a little bit more important and that Simon has done a lot of and that I think gets unfairly lumped in with these other things, which is data journalism. And that is where I think what you're doing, separate from reporting, is you are using streams of information, usually reasonably large data sets, as a way to do reporting, as a way to generate stories. So one way I could find a story is I could go out on the campaign trail and talk to a bunch of campaign operatives and talk to a bunch of voters, and I could intuit from that or learn from that that there is an interesting collision happening around what the candidates say about healthcare. Another way I can do reporting around the election is I can begin loading in polls. And then I can begin loading in data of those pollsters from the past to see how accurate they were before. And then I can weight those by different fundamental factors like the rate of growth in the economy and the incumbency effect that have been proven to have an effect on elections. And I can turn that into a model that is spitting out a forecast every single day of who is more likely to win the election. And then every single day, I can use the results of that model to write about the election. And my information stream, as opposed to being people where I'm reporting, is now data where I'm generating continuous stories off of a model. That's basically what Nate Silver did in the last election. And I think that counts as data journalism. But I do think data journalism, to really sort of be worthy of the name, has to be actually sort of an incoming data stream that you are generating routine stories off of, not just sort of grabbing a sort of a very, very limited snapshot of a sort of small bit of data. I think data visualization is great, but I don't think we have gotten nearly as far as we sometimes like to tell ourselves we have in terms of doing data-driven reporting, in terms of really creating usable data sets that inform daily reporting in a continuous way and create an alternative that I think does exist now, but is very, very hard to stand up to traditional modes of reporting.
So EJ, in your time, how have you seen journalism change? Because we are now casting off so much more data and then also have available to us so much more data. We can pluck for our reporting, whereas before you would have had to go photocopy documents from the Congressional Budget Office or actually get the book of the federal budget. Now that data is easily crunchable in a number of ways. How has it changed what we do?
Well, it's really changed a lot since I was covering the second Lincoln campaign. And I just want to say that my friend David Brooks has taught me that University of Chicago graduates are smarter than anybody else, so it's utterly intimidating to be talking to a whole room of people I know are smarter than I am. And the other thing I was thinking coming down here is how cool is it to have an event on data at the National Archives? And I think there should be like a party favor where Ezra's coolest chart is printed on parchment for all of the people who are attending here today.
That's what Nick Cage was trying to find in the movie.
One of the things that I wanted to underscore is that this trend toward data is a really long time coming. I mean, my first job in journalism was to help set up what became the New York Times CBS poll, where we were trying to create inside a news organization an independent capacity to produce data of our own, where we could ask our own questions, analyze it as we wanted, and not be dependent on Gallup or someone else. And so the drive for this has been going on for a long time. I want to read a quotation. This is a gentleman called Philip Meyer. The world has become so complicated that in addition to knowing how to get information into print or on the air, the journalist must also know how to get it into the receiver's head. In short, a journalist has to be a database manager, a data processor, and a data analyst. That was written by a man named Philip Meyer in a book called Precision Journalism, published in 1991. So the notion that we are dealing with some utter complete revolution, I think, is wrong. I think people have been struggling for this for a long time. Now, what has changed is capacity. And the capacity to analyze data. I mean, again, back in my Lincoln days, there were only mainframe computers. I mean, just when you think about the computing power that's grown in my lifetime, but wasn't the Lincoln days, but in my lifetime, it's extraordinary. And that makes a huge difference all by itself. The capacity to access historical information. I mean, it's very dangerous for columnists. Whenever I write something where I have this vague sense that I might be contradicting myself, I go back and search because somebody is going to find it. And I also think the capacity to check work being done instantly is remarkable. A colleague earlier this week told the story of misspelling in a story Katharine Graham's name, and it actually got into the Washington Post. This colleague said that, of course, if he had done that now, it would have gone out online and on Twitter in about, 2 minutes? Somebody would have noted that he had misspelled Katharine Graham's name, and it would have been corrected. As Ezra just pointed out at the end, the ability to pull together very large data sets and do things with it, that is a capacity that's grown substantially. Though, again, one of the examples I brought with me just to show that way back when people weren't as backward as we think, Bill Dedman of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution won the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting in 1989 for a series called The Color of Money. It was on bank redlining, and it was through data analysis that he was able to show in this series that African Americans in Atlanta or let's do it the other way around. Savings and loans favored the city's white areas by a margin of 5-1. Now, my hunch is Bill Dedman could do more. The data would be richer. It would be quicker. But we have had this desire to use data in this way for a long time, and we're just getting better at it. The last point I want to make, and maybe we can have a discussion like this, and I have to say, to some degree, I learned this from Ezra. I always say, I teach a course at Georgetown called Media and Politics, and I always tell my students that when I started teaching about new media, my first two guests were Ezra Klein, when he was a blogger for the American Prospect, and Ross Douthat when he blogged for The Atlantic. And so I always look at my students and I say, this class was way ahead of the mainstream media because we had Ezra and Ross in before they got their jobs. So this is something I think I actually did learn from Ezra all those years ago, which is that an emphasis on data does potentially get us out of the problem of false balance. A false balance where, on the one hand, on the other hand, well, a lot of times the facts are the facts are the facts. There is no on the other hand with facts. And I think done well, an emphasis on examining what data says can get us away from having to report claims that simply aren't true, or at least be able to challenge quite authoritatively, much more authoritatively, claims that aren't true. And that, I think, is what data have always been about. And the greater interest in data on sites, on WonkBlog or Vox or The Upshot, I think pushes us in a better direction, because journalism ought to be more about truth than about a kind of false balance.
If I think back on my last week, I've checked the lobbyist database at the Senate, I've checked campaign finance records online, I've checked the CMAG Cantor database on campaign spending. So Megan, how does this access, the ability to basically at your fingertips get huge amounts of information and then sort through it, affect what you do on a day-to-day basis? What are you able to do now that 10 years ago or 5 years ago you might not have been able to?
Oh gosh, I mean, even 10 years ago when I started, things like CBO reports and so forth were a lot harder to access. They were a lot harder to find. It was just, it was often they were there, but you had to know where in the archive to go and so forth. And all of that stuff is so much easier to get at. The White House budgets, just all out there. And then 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't available. And I think that access is a huge part of it, is the ability to pull up data and make, but it's also the fact that we have, first of all, when I was at The Atlantic and I did like my second article ever for the magazine and I was blogging for them, and it was a 4,000 word article, which is a short piece at The Atlantic. And it was on counting the number of civilian casualties in Iraq. And I turned it in. Journalists in the audience will be surprised to hear just a little bit over word length. And it included a 2,000 word section on the challenges of cluster sampling and the difficulties of calculating confidence intervals from small samples. And my editor just handed it back and said, no. And I was like, no, this is really important. You need to understand this to really assess these competing studies. He was like, no, no one wants to read it. And in print, that's true, right? In print, you cannot get away with that. Even at The Atlantic, where you have these massive amounts of space to write, is people will just, the technical term is MIGO, my eyes glaze over. People will just be like, okay, next, what's Beyonce doing? So, but the great thing is that on the web, you can totally do that. It's partly that you just have space, right? I'm not going to run out of column inches before and there are so many things that it's just impossible to say well. I mean, I think data viz is really important, charts are really important, but I also think that they can be misleading in a way because they have this, not that your charts are in any way, it's that we tend to think like in the same way that we see video and we think it's true because it looks true, that we tend to fixate on that, and then camera makers, videographers can pull off really quite amazingly kind of con tricks with cutting stuff together in misleading ways and so forth. And it's just impossible to convince your brain it's not true because it looks so true. And similarly, we fixate on numbers, right? We completely get obsessed with, well, there's a number attached to it, and therefore, and people will just say anything. I mean, I think my favorite two weird statistics were one, that the number of abused children doubles every year, which is like very soon. We're going to run out of, the planet is going to implode into a black hole. But the other one with this, and this one was actually really popular with journalists, is that something that like 3/4 of all women in the emergency room were there for domestic abuse charges. And if you actually kind of think about that, just walk into an emergency room, are 3/4 of the women sitting there at any given time? Also, we should have twice as many women in the emergency room as men, and all of these. And no one thought that through. They just kind of, because it's a number. And journalists have gotten way better about that. That statistic doesn't circulate anymore. It was in circulation up to about 2005, and then people started making fun of it on the web, and that kind of stopped. And this is like a bipartisan. I'm picking on that statistic because I remember it. But there's a lot of those statistics that used to circulate and don't. But the thing is that I can get into really kind of very deep in the weeds. Let me walk you through. Yesterday I wrote a post on whether college students should be urging their universities to divest from fossil fuel. And I walked through, not particularly a high-level way, but like a little financial model of like what happens. Okay, we've got group A, group B, this group sells, what happens to the stock price? And it turns out if you go to finance theory, nothing. They just equalize, and you slightly change who has the stock. You could never have gotten an audience to sit through that. And then the last thing that I think that it's done for journalists is that it's freed us a little bit from experts. Right, you look at journalism 20 years ago, and what they could do was call someone who understood the tax code. Because there was no chance that you could look up and do enough research by yourself. You called a guy who knew about that. And so think tanks had this incredible power 20 years ago because they had the guy who understood the tax code. And academia, and obviously that's still very powerful. But journalists are doing more of their own, like, I understand this, I read it, I calculated the numbers. And independently, you look at people like Scott Winship of the Manhattan Institute, who's out there like writing his own very lengthy pieces on inequality and running through the numbers with people and doing things that we just in no way could have done, not necessarily even just because we didn't have access, although that's a big thing, but also because on the web, I don't need 700,000 readers of The Atlantic to want to know about how to calculate confidence intervals from small samples. I just need enough people on the internet. And the internet's a lot bigger than any publication's audience, and that, I think, has made a huge difference for what journalists are able to do with data.
So Simon, I imagine you sitting at a computer watching the whole feed of the internet pass before your eyes. How has all this affected how we think about things, how we talk about things, the debate? I mean, so what? Does it matter?
Doesn't matter. So I have something to admit to the room, which is when I was at school, I was really bad at maths. And I went to journalism school with a lot of other people who were really bad at maths. And a lot of these people now are working places where they're dealing with numbers. I think there's a couple of things here which are interesting to me, one of which is this historical thing. Absolutely, journalists have always worked with data from the financial pages, even people putting together weather pages. That's all about data and collecting data. I think the big differences are that, firstly, the barriers for entry have lowered so much. So even somebody like me who's terrible at maths can kind of build a career out of dealing with telling stories with data, because instead of worrying about maths, really you can use it, that data is a kind of a means to an end. At the end of that is a story or a visualization or whatever output there is. And that's a big difference. There are numerous tools now online which are free, which mean that you can analyze data, you can take messy data and make it clean, you can visualize it, you can create maps. That when I started in the newsroom, you had to go to a guy. There was a guy who did Flash, and that was the only person that could make maps. And the idea of anybody doing their own charts would have seemed completely anathema. So there's that kind of lowering of barriers of entry. And the other side of it is I think, part of a bigger change, which is about the way the journalism has changed, and that, you know, when I started, and perhaps when we all started, being a journalist meant you could literally throw out words into the world. And it was very much kind of one-way process. Those words went out, they didn't come back. You know, now they come back because of social media, because of comment section, because of the way that readers feel that they, not only they know what you're talking about, but they probably know more about what you're talking about than you do. And to me, the stuff that I'm interested in with data journalism is where it involves that community. I mean, when I was at The Guardian, we set up the data blog. Really, it was actually about publishing these data sets because we had tons of data. I thought, well, if we publish it, maybe developers will pick up on it and build cool things, and it'll all be about kind of opening up this information, because at the moment, as we know, there's tons of open data out there. There's data on everything, as we've all kind of said, you know, it's much more available, it's much more visible. And actually what you found was that you would publish a data set and then there'd be somebody out there who had compiled it or knew much more about it that would come back and say, well, actually, you're right on this point, but that point's wrong, and why didn't you look at this angle? And we certainly found that with when we did the WikiLeaks data. We had this huge data set, which is a kind of, you know, an amazing collection of spreadsheets, basically, collecting for the first time all this data about casualties in Iraq, which makes suddenly Iraq and Afghanistan the most documented wars in history. You consider the Pentagon papers, what, about 7,000 documents? And there were, you know, hundreds of thousands of these records. And what you found was actually the people who could handle it were people in the newsroom who could handle spreadsheets or could handle the data. Working with the people who knew the story could actually help tell their stories a bit better. So I suppose in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is that I think what's interesting at the moment is that a lot of organizations you've heard of have discovered data, but this stuff's been going on, and there's interesting stuff happening around the world, perhaps in organizations which we haven't heard of. There's a newspaper in Argentina called La Nación, which has a little data team, and they've, in quite a kind of oppressive and difficult environment, have downloaded every single government data set they can get their hands on, because they know it's going to be deleted at some point, and they've made it available for their readers, they've made it accessible, and they've told stories around exposed kind of great scandals in expenses and so on amongst elected politicians. And this is a little team operating on their own without the great resources that, you know, big organizations have. And that kind of low-key thing is replicated all around the world and everywhere. And I think that's the stuff that I'm interested in, the role of the community and how data becomes better when you share it and you push it out there and you make it accessible. And my thing about a lot of data journalism that I read now is that actually, you know, where's the data? I want to get the link to the data, or how do I find it? And it's not necessarily there. I'm reading something which I know is by somebody who's very clever, and I certainly feel that they're cleverer than me by the time I finish the article. But it doesn't make that data more accessible, and that's what I think we should be encouraging and getting people to do more of.
Something Megan said reminded me of a clear example of why it is different now than when I started out. I have a really, in a way, I have a very starry-eyed view of what we can do now, because only when you compare it to 30 years ago or more do you realize how extraordinary this capacity is. I always liked numbers, and I persuaded my editors at the New York Times in 1976 that there were a lot of cool numbers in the campaign finance reports at the FEC, and they were on pieces of paper. And one of the first stories I found there, by going through the reports on paper, one report at a time, was how much money was raised by candidates for Congress who were unopposed. And it was really quite an extraordinary number. That hadn't been reported before because the FEC hadn't existed and you didn't have that. But it was an extraordinarily time-consuming process of going through paper files and then also looking at, well, gee, this guy rented a car on his campaign money for a year and a half. What was that? And so on. You could do that story now in, a half a day, 20 minutes, and that is where the capacity is mind-boggling.
Although there's still a distressing amount of data and PDF format. Those people are history's greatest monsters.
They know what they're doing. Yes.
No, it's terrible. I still sit there periodically and I'm tallying stuff one by one, copying it.
A friend of mine says PDFs where data goes to die.
Yes.
Totally.
That's a perfect line at a Chicago event.
So I think we can all agree that should be illegal, right?
Absolutely.
There's a line about DC that it's Hollywood for ugly people. And I've often thought that there's a variant of that, which is true about DC in general, but also journalism, which is that it's a place for nerds who are bad at math. You can seem very smart because you can literally count.
I'm very good at math for an English major.
I agree, and I did terribly in math. I'm the son of a mathematician who failed math classes in high school. I assure you that my dad does not think I am good at math. But you take people I have a good reputation. I have a reputation, maybe not a good one, as a wonk. And literally, I don't even need one of the fancy calculators. If you're doing budget numbers, you do plus and minus, and you divide things and you multiply them. You can literally just use one of the tiny calculators. You don't need to even use a scientific calculator, much less a graphing one. And so one of the things where I think that it's funny, because I found myself on the pessimistic side of the panel, not pessimistic, but I think that we as a profession, and I should say we in a limited sense, because there are folks like Simon who are further along in this, we are so far away from knowing what to do with the data sets we have now. We have this tremendous accessibility in the data. And you guys have heard us now use a bunch of examples of people who did really great things by essentially counting data, right? Essentially going through and looking at FEC reports and saying, okay, in this column, we know that this guy does not have a challenger. So in this column, how much money did he raise? And budget. You hear Paul Ryan gets a big reputation as a wonk. And I mean, budget, a lot of the budget math, it's barely math. It's really barely math. And a lot of it is wrong. And not his just in general, but all the budget math. A lot of it is based on just garbage projections. And our ability to really go through this stuff and do more complicated work is pretty low, because the way people come into journalism, the route they come into it through, just rarely teaches them those skills. A lot of political scientists I know are always frustrated at Nate Silver's acclaim, because they're like, that math isn't even hard. I knew how to do that math in my first semester in graduate school. We have this tremendous gift right now in terms of the information we have access to. And we do a better job, I think, reading it and trying to learn about it. But a lot of us, and I'll be the first to say it, the way we do it is we get a paper, and then we read the abstract, and we read the first part, which is the introduction, and then we kind of skip through the methodology section, and then we read the discussion at the end. And that methodology section, it's there for a reason, it's important, but if you get into math that stops using numbers and begins to only use Greek letters, it gets hard for me to follow. And so I'm not saying that there's not value to what we're doing, but I am saying that I do think that I think that we have given ourselves the pat on the back too early. I think there's too much celebration of the data journalism we're doing and a little bit less pressure than there should be on sort of, okay, given our capacity to pull in these data sets now, like, what does that mean about who should become a journalist? What does that mean about the skills we should be learning? What does that mean about continuing education for journalists? Because I think I have a pretty quantitatively skilled newsroom compared to the average newsroom. But every day, like, I am just like confronted with all the things that we can't do because, like, we don't have the level of data analysis and chops that we need. And it's very, very hard to hire in the profession because there just are not that many people with it who've come into this. They're working at Google, they're working at Twitter, they're working in academia.
I wholeheartedly endorse that journalists need to get better at math and get better at. One of the things that actually makes me crazy is this kind of naivete about how. I'll push back a little bit just to say that there's a naivete about how great it is in academia. Like I know lots of economists who are like, I read the math but I can't check the math, right? Like I can't check the underlying data. So all I know is that like if I integrate this, it looks right. And that is, we forget that like they had a lot of choices, right? That maybe they got a first result and were like, well, it doesn't seem right. I should go back and do something, right? And like there's just a phenomenal, people will speak as if like a peer-reviewed paper was actually like synonymous with delivered by God on Mount Sinai, and now we know it's correct. Where it's like a starting point, right? So if a peer review catches really bad methodological errors, it doesn't catch wrongness. I'm surprised.
That's a beautiful line.
I'm surprised that journalists don't run more regressions because it's easy and we have the tools. But at the same time, we're swamped with all this data. We're not, but like you talk to companies and they have the same problem. They're like, I have so much data, I have no idea what to do with it. We ran like 97 regressions and I don't know, nothing. Or they got a bad result and it was spurious, and now they're like trying to backtrack on something that they thought was really tight. I think that this is a problem for everyone in the entire world, is that data is flooding us. There's so much more information, and using it smartly is just hard. So I completely agree that journalists could do better. We need to get way better at dealing with math, at understanding how science works, and not either denigrating it or courting it this like, well, I found a guy who wrote a paper. Like the number of times I've seen a journalist, and I'm sure I've been guilty of this too, take a paper that's like one paper, and they're like, oh, well, now we know that X is true. And that level of skepticism, at the same time, I think we're in the same space as a lot of people. We've come a really long way, and I think that we can go a lot further. And that as other organizations actually get better at this, we're going to get some of those tools too, I hope.
So my feeling about this is that what you've got is you've got this big pile of data over here, which is collected by people who are great at collecting data but terrible at explaining it. And over here you've got people out there in the world who want to understand what's going on. And as journalists, your role is to be a bridge between. I think when you come, as a journalist, when you get too close to this side, it makes you bad at reporting and explaining data to the people here. And when you get too far over here, it's almost like you can't, the data's so far away you can't properly explain it. I think, and I'm going to come back to this thing about the community, because I think I'm really noticing a reluctance, certainly with a lot of data journalism I see here, is that in sharing that data and making it open, because you don't give away your sources. But actually, if you do give away your sources, your work is better, because you're going to be able to work with people out there who just know the stuff really well. So take something like election data. As journalists, we have a kind of vested interest in election data because our organizations will pay for it, pay a lot of money for it. So why would you then publish it? Why would you then kind of open it up? This is like the most basic, real-time election data at a local level is the most basic kind of stuff of democracy. And it's kept behind a paywall, really. And actually, if you did open up, and there are examples. So, for instance, in France, in the last election, the French government let in this kind of hackers group called Regard Citoyen into the Ministry of the Interior, I think, whoever managed the elections. And they were seeing civil servants kind of running around with bits of paper. So what's on those bits of paper? And it turned out that this was local turnouts in different parts of France at different times of the day. This is great data because you compare how it's happening now to how it happened in the last elections. You can see, oh, well, this part of France is actually, there are more people voting now than there were at this stage last time. So they grabbed those pieces of paper, they digitized them, and they published them and they put them out there. The world didn't fall down. Journalists didn't miss out on stories. They gained stories because this group of little hackers were out there doing it. You see the same thing in whenever you kind of let this data open, you let it out there, you can see this kind of flourishing of just useful information and stuff that leads to stories. And I think we've got a responsibility to make this flood of data that's out there just more accessible and easier for people to understand, but also easier to access.
Could I just sort of, I want to be more optimistic than Ezra has been. And even though I fundamentally agree with everything he said, journalists always pat themselves on the back too early and too much. And in a way, I think I always say I'm a psychological optimist because I'm an intellectual pessimist. You know, blessed are they who expect nothing, for they shall not be disappointed. And I think if you look back at what you did with Wonkblog, what David's doing with Upshot, and what a lot of other people, what Simon has done, is what you have now is at least a realization that is much stronger than the realization before of how much we're missing, of how much we need to do, of why this matters. The fact that these are now vital parts of journalism in a way they weren't before. I'll prove that I'm Catholic. You are creating a sense of guilt among journalists that they are not dealing properly or as well as they could with all of this data out there, and therefore we're doing more with it. And that's an extraordinary, that I think is huge progress over 15 years ago. Why is that wrong?
Oh, I don't necessarily think it's wrong. I guess that there are different things that are kind of in this conversation that I would pull apart a little bit. So one place I actually maybe disagree with Megan a bit. One of the things we actually do have now, which we didn't before, is data about our readers. And I think one of the things that has come out in that data is we were just wrong about what they liked. One of the reasons, like, when you say that, like, yes, your editor said no, your editor said no based on what? That he didn't like that section? He didn't run a poll? He didn't show it to 50, it was based on nothing. It was based on bullshit. So I have been in a lot of different mediums now. I've done TV, I've written for the newspaper, I've written for magazines, and I have found that a lot of things people thought did not work, in fact, work really well, and now are being done more often and more aggressively. And it turned out that your online readers are not that different from your print readers. So one thing I think is that there's been the ability for some of these kinds of journalism to spread because we've been able to prove online that this kind of journalism is more desired than people realized it was. So, at Wonkblog, at Vox, I think we do a lot of policy journalism. I think that what we tried to do, I wouldn't actually even necessarily call it data journalism. What I'd say is that we tried to look at politics more through the lens of researching the policy, and more through the lens of political science, and more through the lens of somewhat more quantitative stuff, but also through a different idea of what the reader was interested in. But a lot of those tools are pretty traditional. I mean, I learned a lot about healthcare policy, in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, and I do think I have a little bit more freedom from experts than I would have in another context. But I don't do a tremendous amount of healthcare policy data journalism. I'm reading words, I'm trying to figure things out, I'm talking to people. And I think that's great. And I do think, I do believe that we've had some part in making policy journalism better. I guess the point I'm making slightly differently is that I think there is this other thing out there called data journalism, and I think it is really important. I think we're only really at the beginning of it. I'll give you an example of something I want to do that I just currently don't have the skills to do, although we're beginning to build it now, which is in an election, you have now candidates, say in the midterm election, congressional candidates are sending out press releases, they are sending out tweets, they are sending out all kinds of interesting things. And you can suck all of that communication in and analyze it, right? So it would be reasonably easy to see. Actually, the Upshot did a good example of this recently, where they looked at all press releases from Hill, from members of the Hill, to see how often the word Obamacare is being used. Doing that kind of textual analysis, that's actually, we've talked a lot about math, but that's really not math, it's coding. It's being able to scrape the data, and it's being able to run very simple algorithms that are just looking for particular things. It's not, you're not doing the math, you're telling the computer to do whatever math is needed to be done. there's just a lot of cool stuff we can do like that. There are all kinds of in high math and in high research problems of, all the things Megan said are correct. But there's just a lot more low-hanging fruit that can be picked than we are being able to pick at the speed that makes me happy. I am happy with where policy journalism is going. I really think that's a hell of a lot better than it was a couple of years ago. What you're hearing from me right now is I am not happy with where data journalism is yet. I do think it's different, and I think that when we get a critical mass of the people with the basic skills here to do it, I think that there's just going to be a lot of cool stuff we can do that makes a lot of what we're doing, that'll enrich a lot of what we're doing now.
I want to open up to questions before we run out of time. I guess there's microphones in different parts of the room. I would just say, as the microphones walk to whoever has a hand up, Ezra just gave a tell there. What we haven't disclosed here is that the biggest impact of data on journalism is it now drives everything we do, because we have enormous amounts of data we don't share about what our readers want and will click on. It shapes our headlines, it shapes the stories we focus on, it shapes how we tell those stories. And I think when the history books are written, that will be the big, at least for the last 5 years, transformation.
Especially the last 5 years.
Yeah.
But I think before that even, it used to be that like political columnist was at the very top of the hierarchy, and down at the bottom was like the Metro and crime pages, and it turned out that everyone just wanted the sports and cartoons. And like, and that was becoming apparent 5 years ago.
Right.
But I think in the last year, the ability to kind of titrate these headlines so perfectly.
Like every day, every click is a focus group.
We got a lot of data. You'll never believe what happened next.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thank you all. Fascinating discussion. I'm actually finding you surprisingly upbeat about all of this. Access to data, able to do more, tools of analysis. But isn't there a dark side to this too? The ability to manipulate data, to pull from where you want, the fragmentation of audiences. So it's actually harder in some ways to know what the truth is. Or am I missing something?
I think that's really interesting, and one thing I will respond to that with is that if you make a mistake with your data or you try and manipulate it, you'll get picked up so quickly either on Twitter or comments, or people come back to you super fast in a way that I don't think would have happened in the past, and that's because there is this kind of greater kind of literacy out there, and also because nobody trusts you as journalists now. And so actually they're predisposed to disbelieve you and test everything you say. So actually, I think your audience is the best kind of test bed there can be.
I also think that you could manipulate it before. I mean, I remember reading, I can't remember who the interview was with, maybe Michael Isikoff, but he was defending the he said, she said model of journalism. And someone said, well, if you've got this crazy person who's living in a hut somewhere, and then you've got like 97 respected eminent scientists in the field, you're going to quote them equally. He said, if you write it the right way, then they'll know who to believe. And I thought, well, that's terrible, right? Like, so the object is to pretend that I'm being objective while manipulating you so that you will understand what you're supposed to believe, right? And I'd much rather just come out and say, hey, this is what I think, and provide. I completely agree with you about providing the underlying data set. Is show the work. Put the spreadsheet up there. It's easy. It's free. Put it in Google Docs. Let people click through. I mean, this is actually now a problem for me because Bloomberg View does not allow people. Bloomberg Terminal does not allow people to access Google Docs. But so I get all these angry emails. But in general, right? This is just put it out there and let people see because
in the past there was no way to do it.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
I think a good example of why it's better now is all kinds of claims that got made about Obamacare based on sort of either fragmentary numbers or some numbers taken out of context. And there were so many people around, not only journalists, but all kinds of people who had an interest in this, who had an interest in challenging bad data from their point of view that, I'm not a utopian about in any way that, truth eventually outs from this great interchange. Nonetheless, it's a lot harder now, I think, to maintain a lie with data for a long time. I think there are too many people potentially looking over someone's shoulder, not just journalists, but all kinds of people out there.
I'm going to come in for the doom caucus here. I think it is incredibly easy to lie to people right now. And I think that it is incredibly easy for the people being lied to never even know it.
But not about
hold
data.
on. Yes, about data. And about stories that are about, so Obamacare being a great example. You can argue about who's right, and I'm not even, I have a dog in this fight, but if you are reading about Obamacare on sites that are roughly supportive of it, and you are reading about Obamacare on sites that are critical of it, you're reading just two completely different information streams of stories, right? Like in one, everything is collapsing. Every piece of news has a dark side. You know, if premiums are down, it's because the insurance is shitty. If the insurance is constrained, it's because nobody's buying. I mean, it is just like an endless doom loop. And you can also get the other side of that. And I do think that there is the capacity for somebody like E.J. Dionne to have a vastly better understanding of what's going on than ever has been true before. I think the quality of the information out there for somebody who wants it is much higher. That said, I've become really interested in this thread of research that shows that the people most likely to fool themselves about the nature of political reality, right? Did the deficit go up or down under Bill Clinton? Did inflation go up or down under Ronald Reagan? Are the most highly informed members of the population? The theory would be that you'd have smart people and they'd be better at disproving things that are incorrect. It turns out that the smarter and more informed you are, the better you are at believing falsehoods because you are better at finding information that seems to point in that direction. Now, the one piece of good news I will say is that it just doesn't matter. Like, here is how people make political decisions. They like go to the ballot box and they say, am I a Democrat? And if they're a Democrat, they vote for the Democrat. And they go and they say, am I a Republican? Polarization is so overwhelming. Like the same effect that I'm talking about that ends up sorting people by and fracturing them into different media spheres, it does pull them further away. But the convincing that we imagine happening was always so rare to begin with. And it is so very, very difficult to do. That in general, I think the place where I end up more optimistic, more like EJ, is I do think that for like policy elites and the people who are like paid and have the incentives to get this stuff right, it's better off. And for folks who are reading news as entertainment, I think they were never what we thought they were. And they were always finding information sources that backed up what they wanted to believe and, you know, and developing opinions that, you know, were maybe not wholly based on the best evidence they could find, but, you know,
unlike
that were,
those of us in the policy elite
right.
who only ever use
No, but I do think that one thing I do think is true, and one of the ways I am optimistic and where I do think this kind of journalism is important is, this is true for both sides, the people governing, if you govern really badly, it hurts you. I do think the basic incentives of governance are still pretty good. And people get things wrong all the time because they're human and they make mistakes. But it's not because they thought it would be a great idea to destroy the healthcare system or launch a terrible war or whatever. And so it's definitely not perfect and we all fool ourselves. But I do think that the ability to be better informed is very, very high now. But for voters, I think the ability to self-select and to fool yourself is also higher.
The only thing I had one sentence on Ezra.
I would just say that I think for people in the policy elites, that data journalism has raised the tax on believing nonsense.
Yes,
right? Like
right.
it's very pleasant to believe numbers that are just like some moron you saw talking pulled out of the air 3 seconds before he delivered them, and you'd be shocked how many statistics. I remember trying to track down a bankruptcy statistic about like how many people had committed fraud, and it turned out that some FBI guy had literally been giving a talk, and someone said, how many people commit fraud on their bankruptcy application? I don't know, 10%. Like that circulated for decades as the canonical number. And it has raised the tax for us because it's embarrassing, and also because we like to think that we're using only the best data and so forth. So we don't want to. I think on both sides you really have seen among policy elites a narrowing of kind of the statistics, the numbers, et cetera, that they're willing to use as an acceptable source, because you kind of understand that the stuff that flattered your prejudices, just like you can't say that and be taken seriously.
Let me try and get the lightning round, because I think there are a bunch of hands up. Go.
Just one sentence on Ezra. I agree with everything Ezra
You do one
said.
sentence after.
I'll do one sentence after you then.
What he was describing is not manipulating data. He was describing we manipulating ourselves.
Yes, definitely.
And that is a problem, but that has been a problem for several thousand years.
So my sentence was really about Ferguson. So 5 days after Michael Brown was shot, I just did a little kind of audit of, what do we know in terms of Ferguson? And interestingly, ton of stuff on Fox. Fox was great. Nothing on 538, nothing on the Upshot, but tons elsewhere. So you could learn how segregated the police force was in Ferguson, or the amount of military-grade equipment that ends up in tiny little local police forces across the country. And what I thought was great about that was how widespread this idea was. Let's go and get some data and look at and see if it could tell us an interesting story about why this is happening here. And the fact that wasn't necessarily coming from the new data journalism side doesn't really matter, because it's out there and it's happening. It's kind of unstoppable.
All right, up there.
I would like to say before I start that one of the favorite books I ever bought while I was in grad school at Harris was How to Lie with Statistics. So, my question is around sharing data. Lately, or at least the last few years, you've really seen the rise of the infographic. And I wonder what your thoughts are on using infographics, if they're really that useful, if people really even look at them and understand them.
They're evil.
But there are different types of infographics. So for instance, if you look up infographics on Google, what you'll get are lots of things that are produced by marketing companies, and they tend to be long kind of screeds of random numbers that have been tacked together. And the thing, as a journalist looking at this, has nobody edited this? Nobody's taken anything out. They put everything on because they can't decide what to lose. So that is scary. But the other side of it is that I think people are more informed and literate about what makes a good chart, what makes a bad chart. So for instance, Darrell Huff's book, which you mentioned, there's this great line about how with bar charts, whether you start the line at 0, this is a big deal. And you still see people do it. And when somebody puts out a chart there where it doesn't start at 0, they get jumped on. So I think there are a lot of tools now like Data Wrapper or Carter2B or mapping tools or whatever that make it really hard to make a bad chart, because they kind of police a lot of that stuff out of you. I kind of think infographics as a whole are awful, but I think these kind of marketing infographics, but there's enough good stuff out there that makes it interesting. And there's some people who are not necessarily working for mainstream organizations who are producing amazing visualizations of data that tell you something new about the world, and that's encouraging to me.
I'm not actually against them in theory. It's just that in practice, as you say, they're mostly very bad attention to the quality of the data, often completely misleading and bizarre, and they're put out there to get viral clicks to raise the Google status of those marketing companies, and they don't care whether it's true. They just care if you click on it and raise their SEO for Google.
So I have a question. You've spoken about data and the quality of data, and in essence, the quality of the journalists who are analyzing the data. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the quality of the data consumers, the people that you're getting all this information to. Do they have a greater ability to understand the data, to make intelligent use of it? And if not, how do you improve, as a journalist, the output you put out, as well as explaining the assumptions, the context, et cetera, providing the definitions and so forth? And some of you alluded to some of those things, but in the end, data is data, but what does it mean? What does it tell you? And what's the process of analysis and the context? You need to explain that to the consumer, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
I would say that is my job. My job, it is, if my journalist can't do a data project and then take that project and produce, an article and visualizations and whatever we put in that package, that someone who is not very well versed in data can understand, then we have failed. We are trained, the core, or one of the core uses of the journalist is that we are good at, what we're supposed to be good at doing is taking a complicated world and putting it into a format you can understand and even enjoy understanding. And so I do find that sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, what about the quality of the reader? it's on me and my team to be correct. And it's on me and my team to get this into a format the reader, an interested reader can sort of enjoy and learn. And you shouldn't need to bring all that much to the table except for your interest in order to do that. Now, there's a related question, I think, which is, how does the news consumer know when they're being lied to? You still have a similar process as you've always had to learning which groups, which outfits you can trust and which you can't. But I don't think we can be in a place where we need, readers and an audience who have busy lives to come to us with a fairly sophisticated sense of like how to parse the data. It's great when we can open up and get help from the many, many people in the audience who are smarter than we are, but we also need to be able to serve the people who don't have as much experience in this as we do.
I think I think this is why a lot of data journalism is very simple. Percentage changes, is something bigger or smaller? How does one place compare to another place? And partly I found, certainly when I was in the newsroom, that was so that I could explain my story better to my news editor in a way that they would understand. But also I think it's what you're doing should be replicable. Somebody reading your story should be able to replicate what you've done. And so as a result, it's necessarily simplistic. I was having this conversation with a guy called John Keefe, who works at WNYC, saying how actually we kind of tend to shy away from inferring causation quite a lot. We often kind of identify coincidences. Like this country, which has a high gun ownership rate, has a high murder rate, or whatever that coincidence might be, but we don't know for sure. And partly because causation is complicated. As statisticians hate definitively proving stuff. So I think often what we do is quite simple. And maybe 10 years down the line, we'll all be dealing with really complex statistical formulations. But at the moment, a lot of the work we do is just so simple, straightforward.
All right.
Can I just real quick, two of my favorite quotes about journalism. Hegel is supposed to have said that the job of the journalist is to convey information and hide ignorance. And I have no idea if Hegel said it, but it's always been cooler to ascribe it to Hegel, so I never checked it. And that the journalist is in a constant, especially on complicated things, is constantly, as something really complicated, is struggling you're always better if you fully understand something, but there are times when journalists have to tell a story as best they can without yet fully understanding it. That can be true of complicated data. That can be true of an ongoing event. The other great quotation about journalism is a journalist's job is to separate the wheat from the chaff and then to print the chaff. And I go with Ezra on this, is that our job is to make it accessible. And I think one of the cool things about visualization is a really good graphic is not complicated, and it's not its beauty, it's not its complexity. Its beauty is you can suddenly understand relationships and what's going on by looking at this graphic. And I think that's, so that the challenge for visual presentation of data is the same as verbal presentation. So it's on us to explain it to readers. And if they don't get it, it's usually our fault.
Isn't that the biggest change in what we do, in the sense that when I was trained to be a journalist, it was always about writing pieces, preferably as long as possible so they get noticed. But actually, a lot of what you do now is about output, in a user coding term, is that output could be a piece, it could be a short piece, it could be just printing a number. That number could be amazing and change the story, or it could be a visualization. And that is the biggest change, I think, that data journalism has created to journalism, that your output is not necessarily what you thought it was going to be. You're not necessarily going to be known for words.
We're going to do one question. We're going to answer it very quickly. He's right there. Maybe just...
Rob Wilson Black, Sojo.net. My question is about revenue generation for a new business model to support data journalism and others. If we had longer time, I'd ask what's working and what's not. But in the context of what's working and what's not for revenue generation for this kind of new business model, my question is about the trust factor, the suspicion that you can actually generate with lots of dollars certain data, whether through university research, heaven forbid, and other points. So can we trust the data that's being purchased? As my even 13-year-old daughter jokes, that's brought to you by the so-and-so corporation when she hears data flowing out there. And the second is, how much do you worry about the fact that each of our clicks, likes, page views is driving you surreptitiously, inadvertently, towards a certain kind of research that you, as journalists yourselves, are not quite aware? So, suspicion questions.
I think that it is an ongoing question in journalism, how we're going to fund this operation. It's still pretty expensive. Ad revenue is drying up, not because the web is taking away our readers, but because Google and Facebook are taking away our advertising. And, you know, I mean, Ezra can probably answer this. He's been thinking about this a lot, I'm sure. And I, on the other hand, am working for a fantastically profitable company that makes financial terminals. So, which I recommend as a business strategy to everyone. You know, I think that this is the biggest challenge. No one knows the answer. Like, I'm not sure what the viable scale of any of these operations is in the advertising climate of 25 years, and whether my suspicion is that ultimately you come down to journalism being funded either by corporations or being funded by people with a kind of ideological dog in the fight. But you know what? That's what journalism looked like, and then for basically the reason journalism looks different now was a very strange time in American history. It doesn't look like that in Britain. Very strange time in American history when every city was exactly large enough to support one newspaper and almost no one could support two. And that drove a completely different model of how you pursued advertising. You could say take it or leave it. It's how you pursued readers. And that was probably never stable. It was already kind of being killed off by television. And it will be interesting to see what comes next. But I think it's a big challenge that where simultaneously it's lower cost to produce good journalism than it ever was before, but the revenue may fall faster than the cost.
I think your second question is really important for us because, like Ezra was saying, it's more profitable for me to publish a story that says Obamacare is the worst thing ever or the best thing ever than to publish a story that says Obamacare is kind of complicated. Because if I do the worst thing ever, I'm going to get a ton of clicks come into that headline, the worst thing ever. I do the best thing ever, same thing. And so there are incentives on us every day, which we like to think we fight, but I think in truth, a lot of them happen to us because we're watching the traffic numbers every day as they come in. We know what works online, what doesn't work online. There are incentives pushing us to, just like politicians now say ridiculously insane things to raise money, to misrepresent reality. And I think it is a real issue.
I would only say that I'm pretty optimistic about journalistic business models, and I have a better vantage point on it than I used to. I think that it's very hard to support a sort of print cost structure on digital revenues. It's not impossible by any means to support a digital cost structure on digital revenues. To Mike's point, I think there is definitely I mean, look, I know what the readers want. It's pretty easy for me to target it. One, I think there's value in that. I am not unhappy to know what it is that people find important. I don't think that I have some sort of like incredible understanding of what is important and true, and the things that my readers feel matter in their lives are somehow lesser. I think, for instance, one thing you see has really, really driven a lot of, has changed journalism in the age of social media is stories about race and gender are much more potent than journalists had recognized prior to being able to see the traffic numbers. I don't think we were right about what was important before we thought that these sort of stories about sort of everyday racism mattered as much as they do. But the other thing I'll say is that the grim vision of journalistic revenues, and this kind of connects to 2 points a little bit, is the CPM vision, is the vision in which you are just in a raw race for scale. Because we are going to lose that race for scale to Twitter, to Google, to Facebook. They're going to have more scale and they will target it more precisely than we will ever be able to. But there's always been in journalism and in other things a different approach to advertising, which is this kind of premium brand advertising where they are buying, you know, a specific audience and a specific experience and a specific set of things. Cosmopolitan and GQ remain fantastically profitable publications. And they don't do it because they're the biggest publications in the world. They do it because of they hit the right people in the right kind of way. The advertising is beautiful. Brands feel it helps them to be there. So in this way, I think that if we sort of just chase the immediate next day's traffic problem, right, and every day spend down a small ounce of our credibility in a search for scale, ultimately you end up, if you're just going to be on raw ad exchanges, just fighting for CPMs, you're going to have nothing at the end of the day because there's always going to be a lot of people better off than you are there, even if you write a lot of stories about how terrible Obamacare is. You really do need to be able to offer some kind of, you know, premium proposition to advertisers. So one might be, we are more influential among policymakers than anyone else, and all of a sudden Boeing really wants to advertise with you. That has its own problems, or, you know, without doubt, but nevertheless, like, that is something where I think that there are incentives to be actually a quality product that, you know, that you do kind of have to follow if you're going to make a sustainable business out of it. And I think you do see, various folks in the journalistic world beginning to do that. I mean, I'll even say I think the New York Times, which is certainly still having its cost problems, but has a very high cost structure, is doing incredible things on the digital revenue side. And I think is very, very encouraging. And they know, and one reason they don't do some of the stuff that could increase their scale very rapidly, they could just become a trolling operation, and they could probably double traffic in a matter of months. But that would hurt their revenue long term because they would lose brand loyalty, they would lose sort of what advertisers are buying in there. So I'm optimistic on a lot of this, and I think that one of the things to be optimistic about is that I don't think the incentives all cut towards just a complete race to the bottom of the barrel.
What I worry most about is not anything having to do with data. It's that we may well create sufficiently profitable national brands that will do various good journalism of a good kind. I really worry about coverage of state and local government all over the country. And that what you're seeing is the decline. Local newspapers in a lot of places are in trouble. The number of eyes on those governments, there's many fewer eyes. And that's, I think, a real problem for democracy. And I think we've got to figure out how to fix that. And I don't know, I don't have a model to fix that.
EJ, we were so close to ending this conversation on an optimistic
I'm
note.
sorry.
I want these rarely happens
I want
these
these
days.
smart Chicago people to solve that problem. So I throw it out to you.
And even though I have absolutely no data on which to base this claim, I think this has been an outstanding conversation. Please join me in thanking Simon Rogers, Megan McCardle, Ezra Klein, EJ Dion, and our moderator, Michael Shearer. Thank you all so very much. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook and Harris as well. And we're at politics.uchicago.edu for more events like this in Chicago and DC. Thanks again.